Hey everybody, it's Eric Pierce. This is All the Fanfare. Joining me today is Justin Cox. He's the author of Right Now, How to Pursue Your Dream and Start Writing Today. He's also the founder of the Writing Cooperative, which is the biggest writing-related publication on Medium and just a stellar publication in its own right. And above all else, he is an enormous Star Wars fan, which is what brings him to join me today. Justin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we're talking about Rogue One. When I approached Justin to see if he wanted to come on to talk to me, I said, "What's your favorite Star Wars movie?" And he immediately came back with Rogue One. Rogue One came out in 2016. It was the first Star Wars movie in the anthology series, the short-lived anthology series, of which there's only 2 films, Rogue One and Solo. And I think one of the things I like so much about it is it puts the war in Star Wars. So there's lots of battle sequences, but above all, you kind of get the tragedy and the cost that comes with that. In my mind, it's easily the best Star Wars prequel. I think we can safely call it a prequel.
Yeah.
But those are just some quick thoughts I had. Justin, I'd love to hear what about the movie that you love and why is it your favorite?
Putting the war into Star Wars is a good way to phrase it. I knew it was a prequel. I remember seeing it in the theaters. It was the first time actually I had been to a movie theater with reclining seats. That puts this movie into the time perspective as well. But I remember seeing it in the theaters and knowing it was a prequel leading into A New Hope. I didn't know much more than that, when exactly it was leading in and how it was going to work. And I didn't realize until about 2/3 of the way through that it was actually going to end in tragedy. And Star Wars never ends in tragedy. And
Yep.
And it made me just like, I just was in awe of this movie because it was not anything that I was expecting going into it, and it was still fantastic. And as I continue to watch it, I mean, I've watched it twice so far this year. It's just a great film. It's well done. The character development is great, even though pretty much everybody dies at the end. And it's what I like about it is that it is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy wrapped around hope. And somehow, despite the fact that everybody dies, there's still this end of hope because you know kind of what's coming. And even if you hadn't seen the original Star Wars, then it still kind of leaves on this final little coda at the end that, like, hey, there's still potential, there's still hope for the rebellion to kind of come out on top of this, even though this story and our characters aren't going to see it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I've yet to do this, and I just rewatched Rogue One again in preparation for this pod. And every time I finish Rogue One, I immediately want to start A New Hope because the transition, the handing of the baton is so well done there.
Yeah.
I've yet to actually do it, but have you done that? Have you fired up A New Hope after you finished Rogue One?
I don't think I did it. I've done it immediately after. About 2 years ago, I rewatched everything in chronological order. And so I watched it within a couple of days, but I don't think I've ever done it directly after. And again, I didn't really know it was going to tie in like to the exact moment that A New Hope begins, seeing it in theaters, which kind of blew my mind. And seeing the de-aged Carrie Fisher, at the very end, she kind of turns around. It's this like, what is going on moment? Because I had no expectation that any of that was going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you mentioned you're recalling your first time seeing the movie. I also recall the first time I saw it in theaters, like any true Star Wars fan would. You go to see it in the theater. For me, that first showing, I mentioned before we started recording, this is a movie that gets better and better with each watching for me. But that first viewing, it felt a little disorienting, I think, because for one, like there's no crawl, which I love that decision. You don't need a crawl. I mean, A New Hope is the crawl for this movie.
So we don't need a crawl. Really like weird shriek of a noise.
Yes,
which
right.
It catches me every time. It's like,
ooh. It does. It's like something out of a horror movie, and it really sets the tone.
Yeah.
And Yeah, in the first say maybe third of the movie or a little less, there's a lot of planet hopping, and I remember the first time I watched it, I just had a hard time getting my bearings of like where are we and these characters. I think you quickly can buy into Jin and
Mhm.
Cassian especially, but I remember the first viewing, I was just like, okay, we're on this planet, we're on this planet, and everything looks great, but at the same time, I'm just trying to understand how it fits together.
Yeah.
And it's one of those movies that I think that first viewing is almost like the hardest viewing, and then when you come back to it and watch it again, you kind of see that you understand the puzzle pieces more, and then you're able to just
Mhm.
kind of fit them in. So I guess did you have that kind of experience, or
Yeah, and it's one of those too that the more you know about Star Wars, the more that like you see how all the threads kind of weave together. At the time, I hadn't watched the Clone Wars. I wasn't in like I hadn't gone through any of that. Um, I mean, back in what was it 2016? You said,
yep,
I probably still had cable at that point, and so
same
but I wasn't paying for what Cartoon Network or whatever Disney. What did they call it? It wasn't Disney Plus back then. It was the Teen Disney
Teen
that I
Disney?
think
Yes,
that the Clone Wars was airing on, and so this kind of beat up half android guy in Saw Gerrera, like he shows up and is like, oh, this is an interesting character. Well, at the time, I had no idea that like he actually was in the Clone Wars as his younger version of himself and had a
yep,
pretty big arc in that show, and then later shows up in Rebels and kind of pops up from here to there. And so this movie kind of ties that together. And one of the things that I've recently realized that I actually had to go back and Google because I was like, I thought this was a recent addition, but there's actually ties to Rebels in Rogue One. And so the Ghost is parked in Yavin 4 and shows up in the big battle at the end when the whole fleet like pops into space um, and Chopper kind of
Chopper. Yep.
drives by in one of the scenes, and they page General Sandula, and so these are things that Rebels is probably my favorite Star Wars story altogether, and to see kind of those little pieces get woven in, it just kind of adds to the bigger impact that this movie has. And again, I didn't know any of that at the time when I first saw it. This was a really good movie. And then
hmm
as I've gotten deeper into more of the kind of surrounding stories of the new Star Wars, it just fits even more every time I watch it.
One of the interesting things about this movie is how it uses characters we're familiar with to tie us into the pre-existing story.
Yeah,
We've got Vader, and I think we'll spend probably a decent amount of the podcast talking about Vader because he makes quite an impression. We've got General Tark or General. We've got Moff Tarkin,
yeah,
Leia, even the guys from the cantina that give Luke a hard time. They
yeah.
have a brief
They bump
cameo.
into
They literally bump into Jin. Yeah.
yeah.
I guess of all the returning characters, are there any that stand out to you as especially well done, or which are your favorites?
I so it's one of those that the de-aging technology was. I think this was might have been one of the first times it had been used
Yep.
by Disney for Star Wars, and so Moff Tarkin doesn't age as well as some of the
Sure.
de-aging stuff happens. Like when I guess we probably should have had a big like spoiler alert at the beginning of this podcast, but at the end of season 2 of The Mandalorian, when Luke walks in and just blows everybody's mind. That was like some fantastic de-aging compared to Grand Moff Tarkin. Not the best,
Yep.
but still at the time it was like a big impression to see like how he kind of weaseled his way into taking over
Mm-hmm.
the project because it was successful. And um, but I think my favorite kind of tie back to the previously existing stories is when Bail Organa kind of walks out from the shadows
Yes. Yep. And
and
they
in
play the
the
Force theme. Yep.
yeah
It's so powerful.
in the little conference room where they're kind of trying to decide what they're going to do. And I just the way that Bail Organa's character has been woven in and out of um, taken from the prequels and then woven in and out of the cartoon series, both the Clone Wars and Rebels, and then most recently with the Obi-Wan series. It's just kudos to Jimmy Smits for being able to
Yes.
have the staying power as Bail Organa for the last 15 years or so.
It's funny you mentioned him because I wrote that down when I was taking notes to prepare for this. When he emerges from the shadows in that scene, yeah, I got chills. So they play the Force theme and they know
Yeah.
what they're doing. They're playing to the home
Uh-huh.
crowd, but yeah, it was definitely a wow. That's a great little moment.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about Tarkin, and like you said, the technology's come a long ways in the 8 years since. But considering kind of the gamble to de-age him like that, he's in a substantial amount of this movie, and he has a
Yeah.
lot of. He actually carries parts of the movie, and I think it kind of makes sense because he is so central to A New Hope, and he's in A New Hope you could rightly say that Tarkin is the antagonist and Vader is just kind of his henchman, and that's really
Yeah.
the setup they have in that movie. So it makes sense why they brought Tarkin back, but man, what a gamble.
Yeah, because if I remember right, he had passed away like 5 or 6 years before this movie had been created. So that's part of why it was like such a big deal that it was a CG character, but as a real person. And so, yeah,
yeah,
I agree. It's a gamble, but it pays off because he comes across as this like conniving, evil kind of person that really puts Krennic in his place and has no problem blowing up entire cities. So
yeah, yep. Uh, so I think my favorite returning character, I did like the Bale one. That was a good call. It's actually two. I get really giddy excitement in the climactic battle at the end when the rebel fleet jumps in and they start doing do the call signs, and then we
mhm,
get the gold leader and red leader,
yeah,
and they're using footage from A New Hope for that and doing some trickery with the dialogue and stuff. But I
yeah,
don't know, I get super excited when I see those guys, and again, that's just another to your point earlier. That's just another way they're kind of stitching this closer into what came before. It's just really
yeah.
nicely done.
Yeah, and I guess
So
we should probably also mention the little cameo of R2 and C3PO
C3PO, yeah,
basically being like nobody ever tells us what's going on when everybody's going off to fight, and so
yep, yep. C3PO being C3PO.
yeah,
Uh, let's talk about Vader for a second. I think if you talk about wow moments in the movie, I think Vader maybe has the most wow moment, and I remember
yeah,
being shocked in the theater when you realize that he's in the corridor with these rebels and he's going to slaughter them all.
hmm
But I guess I'm curious for your thoughts on him because I feel like in some ways it's natural that Vader's in this movie. In some ways, I feel like he detracts from it to some degree because I feel like the scene earlier in the movie where Krennic goes to Mustafar and meets Vader in his castle. That scene always felt a little clunky to me, and it feels almost a little fan servicey. Like, let's get Vader in here and
hmm
give him a scene. And so I don't love that scene. But then, on the other side of the coin, I do love the scene where he shows up and slaughters a bunch of soldiers. So, how do you feel about Vader in this film?
Vader is. I don't think he's really that great of a bad guy. I don't think he's that great in any of the Star Wars
Wow,
movies.
that's slanderous.
Yeah, I mean, I like him as a character, but I don't think he's portrayed as super evil at any point, and especially in the original trilogy, you don't really ever see what he is capable of.
Hmm.
And I think this is one of those things where, in the years since, and in all of the surrounding stories, particularly in the 7 years of Clone Wars, kind of developing Anakin's character, and in what we've seen with Obi-Wan and all these kind of, I mean, and then also with Rebels, where he confronts Ahsoka, I, you see the evilness in him that kind of had developed from this kind of, kind of didn't want to follow the rules, kind of Jedi. Um, didn't want to take on a Padawan. Didn't want to like was thrust into this war and kind of figured out he could win by skirting the gray, and and then he kind of really does become evil. But in this movie, in that hallway scene, I think it's the first time I remember seeing what he was actually capable of. And, not just like picking up the Emperor and throwing him in a pit, but like actually um, just slaughtering people without mercy, and they're flying everywhere and hitting the ceiling. And the same kind of feeling I had when again Luke shows up in The Mandalorian. You never really see what Luke was capable of, because he's just kind of like this bumbling kid in the original movies, kind of figuring things out. And then here is Luke, maybe 5 years later, having trained and actually figured out what he was capable of, just destroying droids in that scene. And I think that's what makes Vader's particular appearance in Rogue One interesting, is because it's kind of fulfilling what Vader could have been all along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point. I think you're right. I think if you talk about Vader in terms of the original trilogy, it's almost like I don't want to say he's coasting on his mystique, but it's almost like you're afraid of him because you're supposed to be. And
Right.
obviously, at least in Empire Strikes Back, like he's super menacing. He's killing his own guys because they're letting him down.
Mm-hmm.
And when you come to Bespin and he gets in the lightsaber fight with Luke is the hero of the movie, but he's just getting pushed around by Vader, and really
Yeah.
Vader's toying with him that whole fight. So you get a taste of that, but I think you're absolutely right here. With the Rogue One, we really get a sense of how truly horrific Vader, like at his most Vader-ish, would be.
Yeah.
And I think you also made another great point that I wanted to tap into that when you mentioned Luke and how through The Mandalorian we finally got to see the promise of Luke Skywalker Jedi Master, which is only hinted at with Return of the Jedi. This
Yeah.
is Luke. This is like peak Luke. I think it's just interesting that in these, um, these Disney era projects, we're actually getting glimpses of what I think fans always wanted to see, and
Yeah.
maybe it just wasn't the right time or the right project or the right story to see that. But I don't know if it's fan servicey, but if it is, I don't care, because it's awesome to just get those glimpses of what I think we always knew those characters were, but we never saw them on screen. So when it actually
Yeah.
happens, it really takes your breath away.
I think like part of it was, I mean, A New Hope came out in what, 77?
Yeah.
And you had literal guy in a costume that probably didn't bend very well and probably didn't move very easily, and you didn't have technology that could probably do what you may have wanted to do. And plus back in the 70s, the storytelling was different than it is today. And so big, giant action scenes and that kind of thing wasn't always prevalent in film. And so I think that's part of it. I think the technology has caught up to be able to do some of these things, and so like the fight scene between Vader and Obi-Wan at the end of the Obi-Wan series is talking about showing off what they're capable of. Uh, the entire planet is like part of the battle, and
Yep.
rocks are flying, and like it just none of that would have been possible 10 years ago, let alone 40 years ago. And I think that it's just part of the evolution of the storytelling, make some of those things a possibility, and we get to benefit because we can take these characters that have we, for a lot of us, have more or less grown up with, and see them, like you said, in new lights, see what they might have been capable of, but also see new stories with new characters that are able to um, fill in the gap and show what they're also. I mean, I'm not going to do any spoilers for the Acolyte, but the Acolyte has kind of dropped us in the middle of the High Republic with um, what all Jedi were capable of back when there were Jedi everywhere. And
Mm-hmm.
so we in all of the existing Star Wars stories to date, it's kind of at the end of the Jedi era, and it's kind of this myth: were they real? Were they not? Were they like space wizards? Were they just kind of like Obi-Wan is like the weird guy that lives in the woods kind of kind of persona? And so they as fans for the since the original stories, we've only kind of had whisperings about who the Jedi really were.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be able to see that kind of come to life is just a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I've said the same thing about the Acolyte. I think, not to turn this into an Acolyte podcast, but don't tempt me. But um, yeah, I think that my favorite thing, or one of my favorite things about the Acolyte, is we are seeing, like you said, we're seeing the Jedi at their peak. I mean, we were supposed to see that in the prequels, but
Right.
it's really, that was like the tail end of the Republic, and they were. I mean, they talk about their ability to use the Force has been diminished,
Mm-hmm.
and really the focus of the story wasn't necessarily on the Jedi per se. So we didn't get that. We got a little bit of that flavor in the Phantom Menace, at least with the 2-on-1 battle versus Maul.
Yeah.
But I feel like the Acolyte, you're really getting a sense of this is how the Jedi of the era actually operated, and it's raised all kinds of interesting questions about
Yeah.
their mode of operation, and I love all that stuff.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned the technology. I think that's super interesting because I remember when I was maybe a teenager. So this was a couple years after, like, well, more than a couple years, maybe 10 years after Return of the Jedi left theaters. I used to always talk about, man, if they made Star Wars today, it would look amazing. Like, think about, because at the time, even in the 90s and early 2000s, Star Wars still looked great. Even before the
Mm-hmm.
special editions, they still look good. So my go-to thing was always like, man, if they made Star Wars now, it would blow your mind. I feel like Rogue One, in my opinion, it might be the best looking Star Wars movie. It just
It's
looks really
beautiful.
great. It's so
Yeah.
crisp. The planets, the set designs, the way that they've designed the world to both mimic and pay homage to A New Hope, so that that ties together seamlessly, but then is its own thing. I don't know. To me, it's the best looking Star Wars movie. I think the
Yeah.
Last Jedi is kind of in that conversation too. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think that Scarif is one of my favorite planets because
Yes.
it's this really beautiful tropical paradise, but then they film these like gritty war scenes that people are blowing up and but at the same time it's all brightly lit because it's
Yep.
on this beautiful tropical paradise, and so the juxtaposition there is just really smartly done, to highlight kind of what's going on. I mean, it's almost like you think that these stormtroopers that are stationed there were like stationed on the Paradise Island and like had
Right.
the easy gig, and then all of a sudden the rebels show up and are conducting guerrilla warfare
Yep.
from the like the shadows, and like all hell breaks loose. And so it's just this um beautifully shot film that is, again, that leads into tragedy. And I think you get glimpses of that throughout the whole movie. That this is kind of a war film, and you like the first little battle in on Jeddah in the town where
Mhm.
the Guerrera's guys kind of attack the transport, and there's the shot of the girl crying in the middle of the explosion, and like these are almost like cliche things from war films, but in Star Wars, this is the first time I can ever remember anything like that, kind of taking what is typically like sci-fi fantasy and actually kind of filming it and telling a story like a gritty World War II, war film.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, there's a grittiness to the combat, to the battles in Rogue One that we don't see in any other Star Wars.
Yeah.
Even in, you talk about like the Battle of Hoth or Endor or anything like, the big battles in the prequels, they're all, you're at a distance. There's a
Mm-hmm.
flashiness to it. I mean, the Battle of Hoth, Luke is right in the mix of it, and he almost gets stepped on by an AT-AT, and all that stuff happens, but it still feels rather, I'm going to say, bloodless, in that
Mm-hmm.
there's carnage, but you're not really being forced to reckon with what that means.
Yeah.
Anyone that dies is either literally a stormtrooper, so they're faceless, or it's an extra that you don't know and don't care about.
Yep.
I mean, yes, poor Dak bites it. So yeah, I mean that's too bad for him, and because he was going to take on the Empire by himself. So
Right.
he's the one guy that maybe you feel a little bad about. But I think to what you're talking about with the war aspect, what this movie forces us to reckon with is really the cost of the war side of the Star Wars,
Hmm.
and by assembling this cast of characters, this band of ne'er do wells and scoundrels, and then putting them in harm's way, and then not flinching, and then actually having the courage as a story to say, let's be realistic about what would happen. I think that's a lot of the reason why it's painful even to rewatch it now and see a lot of my favorite characters die, but it feels realistic in a way that some of the other Star Wars don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where the power of making it a true tragedy works, because you want to root for these characters, and even though if you've seen it, you know what's going to happen. You still want to root for them, and you want them to
Yes.
succeed. And um, you one of the questions that you kind of sent ahead of time to think about was the most impactful death,
Yeah.
and I think so. For me, it was the moment when when
Yes.
the
Yes.
ship explodes, because
Yes.
that for me was the moment that I realized, oh, none of these people are making it off this planet. Like
Yes.
that, because they make that Cassian makes a point to say to him, you're our only way off of this. Keep the ship ready for us. We'll be back. And then you see kind of this arc where the scared pilot has to go out and hook up the communication relay, and he draws the courage and to make it happen, and he gets the guys that are stationed with him on the ship to like get into the game, and then this rogue uh, grenade comes in, and he sees it, he acknowledges it, he knows what's going to happen, but he had just done his job to get the communication through. And then you realize, like, that's that, at least for me, that's when I realized, like, this is ending in tragedy. And
Yes.
but at least they got the message through.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I think you're totally right, because he was, as Cassian says, he's their ticket out of there. So once the ship was gone, they have no way off. For me, too, the other thing about specifically Bodhi, his death is he's kind of a non-combatant. He's just there. He flies him in. He's kind of the unassuming kind of. He's non-threatening. He's kind of a jokey character.
Mm-hmm.
In a traditional movie, he would be the guy who would survive along with the main character. So
Yeah.
when he dies, and to the point you made, it's the way they do it. He has the camera flashes on him and locks onto him for a second. You see the look in his eyes. He knows he's about to die, and which makes it
Mm-hmm.
even harder. And then
Yeah.
it blows up. Yeah, I was thinking about this. I kind of feel like too. It's equally tragic that every one of these characters, every one of these characters that dies, they do so not knowing if ultimately they're going to be successful. Even
Yeah.
up to our main characters, they've transmitted the message or the plans. They know the rebels have the plans, but then they die not knowing if that's going to be enough, right?
Yeah.
So that's almost the real tragedy is they give their lives for this, and there's something maybe beautiful about that, but at the same time, they 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 don't know if the rebels are going to be able to take the Death Star out or not.
Yeah, and that's the character arc for Jin that I really appreciate, because when
Yep.
you first we first meet her, she's this child thrust into a hole in the ground to
Yep.
uh, be safe from the stormtroopers. But really, when you kind of first meet her, she's in prison, and as you kind of gather her story, you learn, like, she has this line that basically, I forget exactly what it was, but it's basically like, I could never afford to take political sides.
Hmm.
Like, it that she's kind of been, yeah, she might see that things are going bad, and that maybe the empire is not great, but she's just trying to survive and make it, and live day to day. And so she's trying to avoid everything at all costs. And then by the end of this, she sees what's possible, and she sees how individuals can make a difference. And like you said, she she's the one, not Cassian, she's the one that watches the explosion wave come at them,
Yep.
because she's kind of, I think she's the one that realizes that there is hope in all of this, and she's the one that had none at the beginning, and then that's part of why, even though this is a tragedy, every time I watch it, I walk away feeling like I walk away happy, because I know that what they did mattered, and even if this was the only Star Wars that I ever saw, that story is done in such a way that it shows you that, yes, they don't know if the plans got through. Cassian and Jin actually say to each other, "Do you think anybody's listening?"
Yeah.
And when they send it, and they don't even know if it was been received, but they trust that it has been, and they have hope that what they did made a difference. And then, as
Yep.
we know, because it's technically a prequel, it did make a difference.
Kind of relate to what you're talking about. I feel like this is one of the better acted Star Wars movies. I feel like all the
Mm-hmm.
performances are note perfect. You think about the cast, it's pretty broad, and we have a lot of characters that we're introduced to, and some get longer introductions than others. But even someone like Cassian, his introduction is meeting with another rebel and then killing him in cold blood
Yeah.
because he's going to be exposed otherwise, and they has to, he's all about protecting the alliance, and he sometimes has to make hard decisions because of that. We get those little moments, and I feel like it's interesting when I think about, and I called this my favorite Star Wars prequel. The downside to the actual Star Wars prequels is I feel like they missed out on some of the character development,
Yep.
some of that's some of that's the downside of the script itself, but then the performances too. In this movie, maybe because it's more grounded, it's less about the Force, and it's more just about people struggling against this empire, this evil, something that a lot of people understand and could buy into. I don't know if that's the reason, but I feel like the performances in this movie are just across the board. There's something there that you can relate to,
Mhm.
even if you don't watch Star Wars. I feel like
Yeah.
the story itself and the performances are just, yeah. To your point about when you're done watching it, you're moved because of what you just saw, and you came to care about these people, and it sits with you.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's a testament too that to what this film did, that there has been expansions of these characters. So
Yes,
the Andor story, which is fantastic,
absolutely.
is because we get this glimpse of this, like, yeah, this rebel who is technically a good guy, but he lives in the gray. He kills this guy. He's willing to kill Galen Erso just because his commander told him to. And you see him start to question and start to think for himself. And then, because of that glimpse we got, they did an entire amazing series, and that I think the second season is coming out
Yep,
next year.
yep. They
Um,
just announced that Krennic's going to be on it too, so super
okay.
excited about that. Yep.
And so, I mean, put Ben Mendelsohn in anything, and he'll be
Absolutely.
fantastic. But and then, so the same thing has happened to a lesser extent, but with Jin, there's a book called Rebel Rising that is just fantastic, and it tells the story of Jin from the point where Saw gets her out of the hole to the point where she's in the prison at the beginning of uh, Rogue One. And so it kind of fills in the gap of how Saul raised her and then abandoned her. And um, I mean, I would love to see that turned into a
Mhm.
series, because it's just so interesting. And it's a testament to these characters. And we haven't talked yet about the two Guardians um,
Yep.
in Baze and is it
True, I think.
yeah. And that was my first introduction to the Guardians of the Will,
Hmm.
Guardians of the Wills, and that there's this whole other like religion that kind of surrounds the Force, but isn't connected to Jedi, and that these are kind of like they're almost like retired cast aside monks, that the monk order has ended, and they're like trying to figure out what they are. And I mean, the one guy has a gigantic gun, so you got to figure that they're kind of like either mercenaries or whatever they're doing to kind of survive. But there's still this grounded, like, there's still this grounded faith that they have. And even if Baze has basically lost his, he still has faith in his friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where his faith is derived. And so, like, I think you could build an entire story arc around these guys and what got them to this point in Rogue One as well. And again, that's a testament to the character development that happens. And those two are probably the least developed out of all of the quote unquote main characters, and it's still interesting enough to merit further exploration.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. True, he's Jedi adjacent.
Yeah.
Obviously he's in touch with the Force. It seems like maybe it's a incoming connection versus an outgoing. Like he can't control it, but he can feel it, kind of deal.
Mhm.
But there's a scene in the movie where he makes a sacrifice, where he trusts in the Force and he walks
Yep.
into a literal hailstorm of laser fire unscathed,
Yep.
repeating his mantra. That might be the single best use of the Force I've ever seen, because it's completely, it's tying to the Jedi mandate of, for knowledge and defense, and he's just giving himself over to the Force. He's by the way, he's blind, so he can't even see anything. Which there's this funny moment when he actually reaches the console. He starts fumbling for the switch because he's blind.
Yeah.
He can't see it.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. I just love that kind of, to bring up the accolade again. I just love how we're starting to get these different takes on what the Force is and how it can be used, and that it's not always just a lightsabers and telekinesis thing.
Yeah.
Here we have this guy who he's this great combatant because he trusts completely in the Force, and that overrides his inability to see. And then to your point too, they're kind of, him and Baze are kind of like fallen monks, or at least unemployed monks, we'll
Yeah.
say. And Baze seems to have lost his way a little bit, but then at the end, when True is dead, Baze repeats the mantra as
But
he's
backwards.
dying. Yeah, like I'm one with the Force with me. And then it's almost like a little bit of redemption for him too.
Yep.
Unfortunately, he dies too, because that's the way this movie is.
But he dies going out, taking a bunch of folks out, and then when he realizes he's about to die, he looks at his friend,
He looks at his friend.
and
Yep.
that it's just this like powerful. There's this connection, and the character, you care about the characters, and at that point the pilot had already died, Bodhi had died, so kind of like this
Yes.
isn't going to end well for any of them, and
Yep.
so, but like it is tragic, but again, like you said, there's this sacrificial kind of moment for really kind of for both of them, because it is a moment where Baze does, refind himself or his purpose or whatever you want to call it, and but gets it wrong. He repeats the mantra backwards,
Yep.
which is kind of like, it's like he's trying again,
Yep.
and that he knows he's going out, but he's gonna do so honoring his friend.
Yes, yes, it's a great scene. You just said something a minute ago too, of talking about how we're affected by these characters and we're bought into them in the course of this 2-hour movie. And I just rewatched Attack of the Clones last week, and I did a pod on it. And part of my complaint, I think it's probably my least favorite Star Wars movie, next to The Rise of Skywalker, but part of the complaint with that I have with that movie is you cannot buy into the relationship that Anakin has with Obi-Wan at all. And
Yeah,
I feel like
or
that's,
Padme
or even with
either.
Padme. Yeah, yeah. He's just a black hole. And I feel like if you get that right, then you get at least 75% of the prequels right, because then
Yeah.
it's really tragic when Anakin falls. But because you kind of don't really like them together anyway, when they start to fight each other with lightsabers, it's like, okay, well, I knew it was going to go here anyway, and that's
Yeah.
fine.
The way I look at it is that, say what you want about the prequels. I mean, I don't think that they're particularly great movies. But the way I look at it is, if Anakin's story had been told better, there wouldn't it wouldn't have taken 7 seasons of the Clone Wars to show how Anakin went from Jedi to Sith Lord.
Yep.
And because his story wasn't told well, it took 7 seasons of the Clone Wars to really
Absolutely.
show his character development and his change. Because, yeah, based on all that existed in Star Wars to that point, and based on what the prequels had one job, and it was to show Anakin going from Anakin to Vader,
Yep.
and they didn't do it. And that's part, going back to what I said earlier about Vader, that's part of why I don't think he's that bad of a bad guy. And in Star Wars sense, there's been far more menacing bad. I mean, Thrawn, for example, in the Rebel series and brought back into Ahsoka, he's not like physically menacing, but just from a calculating, like, destroying of his enemies standpoint, I think he's a more menacing bad guy than Vader is. I think that Darth Maul was set up to be a more interesting character than Vader, but then is just kind of cut short. And again, through 7 seasons of the Clone Wars, becomes this like really like evil, calculating guy that ends up taking over the entire planet of Mandalore and like losing his mind at one point. And I think that the prequels. So going back to our topic, Rogue One does a better job at telling character-driven stories than the entirety of the prequel series does for really any of
Absolutely.
them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's crazy because, so with the prequels, we have 3 movies, and coming out of those, there's only a handful of characters I actually like. In this movie, it's kind of a ensemble cast situation where we're bringing this band together, and so you've got your 2 mains with Jin and Cassian, but Bodhi and Baze and True, and they're all equally important in my mind, and I'm just as bought into those guys, and I
Yeah, I
feel
mean,
more attached to any of those guys than I do to like Anakin.
yeah, and even Saw Gerrera. I mean, you get him
Yes.
for a few moments, and he comes in. He's got like one leg that is like a metal peg, basically. He's got like a sandal on. You can see he's been through some stuff,
Yep.
and he's leading this group of rebels out in the caves. And we know briefly from the encounter with Jin and the actual rebellion that he's kind of this splinter group, and that isn't afraid to take on guerrilla warfare in the middle of Jeddah. And so we don't know much about him, but even from that little kind of glimpse where he embraces death, kind of like all of the characters kind of embrace death at some
Yes.
point in this
Yep.
movie. He sees the wave coming and he takes off his respirator, and it's like he has, by giving the information to Jin, that's his glimpse of hope that he gets, that
Yep.
allows him to embrace his end of the story, which again, it makes you want to say like, okay, give me more. Tell me, who
Yes.
is this guy? Where did he come from? And how did he get to this place? And so I just think that all the characters are just done very, very well.
Yeah. And I too, I like the, speaking of Saw, I liked how this movie presented the idea that the rebellion isn't just it's not just this monolithic group of just good
Yeah.
guys. There's extremists that
Mm-hmm.
you could say their objectives are aligned. It's to take down the Empire, but their methods are totally different. And Saw
Yeah.
and his guys might be okay with some collateral damage that the actual Rebel Alliance is not. And you have this schism, and this movie doesn't explore that a lot, but just the fact that it exists and it's given screen time, I think it's just a nuance that I appreciate in a Star Wars movie that traditionally we don't get. Usually it's white
Yeah.
hats and black hats. So I like this movie loves to live in the gray, and I like that. One of my favorite moments from the original trilogy is when the unaltered original trilogy is when Han kills Greedo, because it's
Yeah.
a very it's a character defined moment, and it's very great. It could be black depending how you look
Mm.
at it, but it sets up his character in an interesting way, and we get that kind of scene with Cassian in this movie. And I just think it's when you kind of take the gloves off and just let the story be told in a way that fits the story, I think you get better stories,
Yeah.
really.
So It's interesting that you say that because I remember I remember reading a article in college. So this was some 20 years ago. The prequels had probably just wrapped up or were in the middle of it somewhere. And I remember finding an article on the early days of the internet that was an article from the early 80s, right after Return of the Jedi had been um, released, and it was an interview with one of the producers from Empire and then Return of the Jedi. And he was talking about how Return of the Jedi was supposed to end differently. But because of the success of Empire, the story got changed because Lucas refused to let any of the characters die because it would affect the toy sales and
Yep.
the follow up um, merchandising. And so Jedi was supposed to end in this kind of tragic way where yes, the rebellion won and they defeated the Empire, but Leia is left to kind of govern a new, well, the new Republic, basically, govern this new kind of order. And Luke, as the only Jedi, is kind of left going off into the sunset. And I remember it was the way they described it. It was like a western where the hero kind of rides off on his horse at the end, and you don't really know what happens to him, if it was worth it, if like he killed and he lost his friends but they won. And
Hmm.
I think that that kind of that kind of ending could have set a different tone for future Star Wars stories. And what I appreciate about the current era that I think you can probably attribute largely to Rogue One is that it wasn't afraid to go in that direction. It
Yes.
wasn't
Yep.
afraid to say, yeah, we've got main characters. We've got characters that people might attach themselves to. But if the story merits it, they might not survive, and that's okay if their story is told well. Um, and I think that this kind of fulfills that initial vision of what could have been for the end of the original kind of trilogy.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard the same stories about that. And in fact, speaking of Han, I think Harrison Ford was had some issues because he thought Han's arc should have ended in Return of the Jedi with him dying to save the other two. So he
Right.
was on board with that kind of direction too. It's kind of sad in a meta sort of way. If you look at Lucas, he started out as this visionary story guy, and along the way he got corrupted by essentially by money, and
Yeah.
he compromised his story principles. And in a way, it mirrors the story of Anakin. He fell to the dark side. He was
Mm.
corrupted by the thing. He wanted to be an independent filmmaker because he didn't want anybody meddling in his story decisions. And in the end, he meddled in his own story decisions for money reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting that you put it that way because that's what happened. And going back to Han, it would have been a complete arc if he went from kind of like Cassian, from this
Yes.
scoundrelly kind of gray character to sacrificing himself to save his friends. And you get that with Cassian. You get that full arc in the 2 hour story of going from just kind of, like, oh, is he a good guy, is he a bad guy?
Yeah, right.
He definitely, like, he follows orders, but he doesn't question if those orders are valid, and all the way to embracing the end and believing that, hey, what we did was worth it and it mattered and it's going to make a difference.
Yep. Yeah. So speaking of Cassian, do you have this is maybe a bit of a loaded question, but do you have a favorite character from this movie? Or who is your favorite character?
So I think I go back to Jin. I think
Yep.
her story is just my favorite just because of the arc, and then it's probably influenced by the book because I just think that story is just great. I
Hmm.
think Cassian, because of what has happened with the Andor series, um, is great. Even though it does the Andor series kind of takes the "I've been in this fight since I was 6 years old" line
Yeah.
from Rogue One and puts it in a little bit different context.
Different
Um,
context.
but I think that his character is great throughout all of the other pieces. Um, but I think it's in this conversation. It's also worth mentioning that um, Alan Tudyk as
Yes.
K2SO,
Yes.
um, as just kind of I love a good snarky droid, and
Yep.
so Chopper from Rebels is my favorite droid of all of Star Wars because Chopper doesn't care about anybody. He kills other droids. Like
Yep.
he's just this like messed up little guy, and K2SO is just super sarcastic. And my favorite line is that when they're all kind of gearing up to take to defy orders and go to Scarif, and which, by the way, starts the entire war.
Yep. Yep.
And so Jin starts the war because she's
Yep.
not willing to sit by and let politics kind of get in the way. And but there's this line where K2SO says, "I'm going with you guys because Cassian told me I had to."
Yes.
It's
Yep.
like, oh
Absolutely.
yes. But then
Yeah.
ultimately, again, K2SO knows what the droid itself is doing and sacrifices itself to protect Cassian and Jin because the mission is what's important. And
Yep.
so, I think that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting. I haven't revisited Andor. I'm dying to, and in fact, I kind of want to buy the 4K disc just so I have an excuse to rewatch it. But I really want to revisit it in light of Rogue One, and it's what I did like. I mean, Andor is just great, but what I really like about it is how it recontextualizes Cassian in this movie. You understand his motivations a little
Yep.
more, and it just gives, especially those early scenes where you're just trying to figure out who this guy is. It gives context and color to who he is in this
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah.
Um,
He talks in Andor about, um, he mentions his sister, and then he's got that relationship with
mhm.
Bix. And
Yep.
I just, in the context of that, it makes some of the character choices with Jin make sense because there's not a romance there
No, no.
in Rogue One. Like you could a
There
lesser
is a
movie could have
there's a moment there at the end when I think
in
they're
the
like in an
elevator.
elevator, right?
Yeah,
And they're like 3 inches from each other and they're staring into each other's eyes. And it could just be okay, we're probably gonna die situation, but um
I think a lesser movie could have made that into a kind of a
yes.
romance thing, but I think in Rogue One it's not, and I think you learn through Andor that it's kind of, I think he sees Jin as that sister that he needs to protect and needs or in kind of like the way that he saves Bix from the
Mhm.
prison in Andor. I think he sees, it's almost like that brother sister relationship where they're going through this together. They don't really have a choice, even if it's not the choice that they would have made. But they find themselves in this situation, and they're going to face it together and be there for each other um, until the end. And I
Yep.
think that's why they embrace at the end. And I think there's something powerful about the way that she stares into it and he looks away,
Yep.
and
Sure. Yep.
that they're supporting each other in that. Um, and yeah, I think that relationship is just, it's well done, and then it's fleshed out even more with his motivations through the retelling of Andor. Now,
Yeah.
I've not done Rogue One to um, A New Hope, but I have done Andor directly into Rogue One. And so, even though there's a season to go with Andor that directly gets us there, it just feels like the right thing to do after you finish the Andor season.
Right. Yeah. How did that transition go?
Oh, it's great. I
Okay.
mean, because basically, um, the end of Andor, you kind of have him realize, like, he goes back to that prison, or where he got arrested, and gets
Yep.
his stash of money, which happens to still be there after
Still be
years, but
there. Yeah.
um, but he gets his stash of stuff, um, and kind of goes and saves the day, and then sends off Bix and the crew to go to safety while he's got other things to do. And you don't exactly know what those other things are going to be, but it ties in nicely to him kind of showing up, and getting as a rebel intelligence officer. And so you don't know what happens in those intervening years, but you know that he continues to find himself, um, and fight for the good guys, even if he does it in maybe questionable
Sure.
methods. His motives are good, but again, that goes back to like what you were saying about Saw, that his motives, he might have the same aim, but his motives are questionable. And I think this movie does a nice job at asking the question, like, can you win a war? Can you stand up to fascism and tyranny without breaking some rules?
Sure.
And can you win without lowering yourself to
Yes.
the
Yep.
to being bad, or living into that gray? And I think that this asks that question nicely. And if you look at it in context of all the other Star Wars stories that have been told since, that's kind of the running theme when you're looking at either the Jedi or the Rebellion or the New Republic. That, like you said earlier, it's not just white hats and black hats anymore. It's like there's this is a little bit more complex.
Hmm.
And yes, the Empire and the First Order, they are always the bad guys.
Yep.
Um, but the choices that some of the others make are they can be questionable. And I think that adds a layer of realism to this space opera told a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that like you said before, that people can actually relate to the choices, because choices are never black and white. There are always some kind of gray involved.
Yeah. 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 I think you're hitting a lot of great points. I think you're right that this Rogue One and then also Andor, it does a good job of kind of posing the question of, at what cost victory. So like what,
Yeah,
any victory worth having, you're going to have to sacrifice something of something, and a lot of times you're sacrificing part of yourself. Cassian, he's killing people that are on his own team. That's
right.
got to weigh on him, and I think this movie does a good job of exploring that too. He's been ordered to assassinate Galen Erso. He goes out in the rain with the sniper rifle. He has him in his sights. He could take the shot, but he doesn't. And I don't know if that's because, like you said, he feels a connection to Jin. If he feels like it's just wrong, or maybe he's just hesitating, and then the moment's gone because the Krennic shows up, and then the X-wings show up, and the moment's gone. But
Yeah.
the fact that he hesitates, um, yeah, this movie, like I said, this movie and Rogue One, I kind of look at them together, and I like how they kind of muddy the waters just a little bit on what's right and what's wrong, and what you will do to fight wrong. Like you fight fascism wherever you encounter it, but at the same time you have to be aware of like what you're letting into your own soul in doing
Yeah.
that.
I think that that leads into why, as I'm thinking about it, every character embraces their death in this movie.
Hmm.
Every single one of them does. Um, the and I think that might be them coming to terms with knowing that they've made choices that, like you said, might not have been easy or considered honorable, but that at the end they knew it was right to accomplish the overall goal. And so from Saw at the very beginning, embracing his death, to all the way along to Jin and Cassian at the very, very end, I think that that there's something to be said there. And then you could even make an argument that all of those nameless rebels that go through the various stages of the ship, passing the information along, who they know they're not making it through those doors, but they keep passing the disc until it gets out to the Tantive. Then there's something to be said that they're doing the same thing. That they know what they're all fighting for, and they might not make it, but hopefully, the overall cause will.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hope. I mean, that's the theme of this movie. Rebellions are built on hope, and they throw that around a lot. Do you have a favorite moment or two in the movie that just jump out at you as special?
So it's hard to say. There's something very, again, the way that it's shot, of Jin on the catwalk to realign the satellite dish at the very end, where she's got her gun in her hand because who knows what she's going to encounter, and she's kind of hobbling along. She's been beaten, and she's fought, and she's at the very end, and she's kind of hobbling to realign this satellite dish. There's just something that is really very prettily shot about that scene.
Mm-hmm.
The stormtroopers on the beach. It's something that has not been seen. You see stormtroopers in the desert, and you see stormtroopers in the woods, but in the beach, there's just something really pretty about that. And then I really like the scene where the rebels strike on Scarif, and it's shot from the tower, and Krennic's looking down, and you see these explosions all over the little area, and you had just heard Cassian give the order to make 100 men feel like 1,000 or whatever it was, or 10 men feel like 100, and you see it kind of playing out, and everybody in that room except for Krennic is kind of taken off guard, like what's going on. And he obviously yells at everybody to get into action, but it's just the way that it kind of plays out is just, there's something pretty about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Everything on Scarif looks great. I think one of my favorite moments, it's a little one, but when the Rebel fleet jumps into the system on Scarif, and then the X-Wings start making their run to get through the gate before it closes, there's just intensity, and I like the camera angles. It feels almost like you're right in the cockpit, and it just feels fast and fluid. I think for me, I love X-Wings, and for me, this movie is like X-Wing porn. There's so many good X-Wing scenes that I just get excited about them, and part of that I think is just it's the sounds and the look up from the original trilogies that I'm probably reacting to, but it's turned up 300 degrees, because this is, like I mentioned before, it's taking the old Star Wars and then remaking it with new technology, so it just looks phenomenal. But I've always loved that little moment.
And to that point, in that same scene there, talking about sounds, the scene where they call up the Hammerhead Corvette to knock out the powerless Star Destroyer and take out the other one, and then it falls into the shield gate, and they do that without sound. It's just the music playing, and there's just something impactful that's right at the end, where they've managed to get they've managed to send the signal. You know what's coming, but there's just something really well done about that whole sequence.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I love basically the third act of this movie is just straight fire. The rest of it leading up to it is great Star Wars, and like I said, my appreciation for it has increased each time I watch it. But then when you get to the third act, it's just pedal to the metal, and it's just exciting, and it's beautifully shot, and it's moving,
Mhm.
and it's just really really well done.
Yeah. It's
Uh,
a shame that, I mean, we're not going to really talk about Solo, but I liked Solo too for
oh,
what it was.
absolutely, yeah,
And it's a shame that this movie and Solo get such a bad rap for kind of ending the experiment of these one-off stories, because I don't, in hindsight, I mean, we could have a whole nother podcast on quote unquote Star Wars fans ruining Star Wars. But I think that these films get a bad rap because they, vocal folks kind of said that these were not good movies, and it changed the Disney strategy away from telling these one-off stories. That is too bad, because I think there's power in these one-off stories, and I think you see that with some of the Disney Plus series is that they've done, and whatnot in the years since. But um, I just think that this movie by itself was fantastic, and it could have led to more fantastic standalone stories that were told in different ways. And
yeah,
so one of the things that I think that the Marvel universe has done well is tell different stories with different types of storytelling. And so you can have a horror movie in the Marvel universe, you can have a mystery, you can have an action. Like, it doesn't all have to be the same. And this movie for Star Wars showed you can do a gritty, gory battle scene, you can do a war focused movie, and it works. And it could have led to more interesting options.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree. It's like you. I think Solo. I was like almost religiously against it going into it because I love Harrison Ford, and Harrison Ford is Han Solo, and the idea that you'd go back and tell his origin story, it kind of felt sacrilegious to me. And I'm being facetious, but at the same time, like I wasn't super enthused about the idea because I was hoping for more stories like Rogue One, where we were getting stories about characters we didn't already know and
Yeah,
exploring parts of the galaxy we hadn't seen already, not getting backstories on characters that really need none. Han Solo
yeah,
doesn't need an introduction. We know who he is. At the same time, I really like Solo. It's a fun movie. It's a
yeah,
different Star Wars movie. There's apart from Darth Maul's little cameo, there's no Jedi, there's no Force.
yep,
It's scoundrels. It's gritty. It's a heist movie.
yeah,
It's really
exactly.
exciting.
And I would argue that Solo is actually the origin story for Kira that never gets
Yes,
fully
we never
told.
get. Yep,
Um, Again, it could have been, these two films could have led in a different direction than what we got. But I'll take what they are, because they're great. Um,
absolutely.
it's it's just, there could have been more. But like I said, we could have a whole other discussion on how
Yes,
vocal
easy.
quote unquote fans are, who, jumping back briefly into the Acolyte conversation, there's a whole lot of that going on right now.
Yeah,
Um,
yes. It's
but
it's
that's
almost to the point where like I'm not an actor or anything obviously, but if I was, like Star Wars would be like my mecca, like that would be the one thing I'd want to do. But it's gotten to the point where I don't know that it would be hard to say yes to a Star Wars because you would know part of what you're signing up for is that baggage of the fan rhetoric, and some of it's just plain old hate.
Yeah,
And I
hate and
just don't get
racism,
the
misogyny. I mean,
it's
there's
yeah.
all of that. That's why I say quote unquote fans. I don't think the people who are vocal about that kind of stuff are fans, because
Yes,
fans just enjoy stuff.
absolutely.
And whether it's, the way I look at it, whether it's good or bad, it's new Star Wars, and I'm going to have fun.
Yes.
And if I watch it again, great. If I don't, hey, it was a story that was interesting. And so, but yeah, that's a whole other storyline. But I don't think that, I saying that they're fans is, there's something about the internet outrage machine where people get clicks and live into a particular persona, to buy engagement. And hey, if they really believe all this stuff, and and then they got to check their own world, because it's almost completely opposite of what the stories are telling and emphasizing. but
Absolutely.
but
They're
again,
missing the
it's
message of Star Wars.
yeah,
That's the
exactly.
irony. They're totally missing the message.
Yeah, there's no hope in like arguing that there's a woman as a, like, how dare they focus on a woman, and how dare they have the biracial families and lesbian couples, and like, how dare they do any, like, all that stuff is just comical to me, because like, who cares? Tell a new
Exactly.
story.
Exactly.
Like,
Don't yeah, and
that's
if
what
you
makes
don't
all
like
this
it,
so
don't
interesting.
if you don't like it, don't watch it. Like nothing's
Yeah,
saying you have to watch the latest Star Wars.
yeah,
I am not shy in telling people I don't like the Rise of Skywalker. I just don't watch it. I sort of pretend it
yeah,
doesn't exist, and like it doesn't affect me from liking any other Star Wars. Like you can do
yeah,
that. It's just, I mean, at this point, the Star Wars galaxy, and if we're going to continue to have more Star Wars, which we're going to, there's going to be some that you vibe with, and others that you don't for personal reasons or whatever it is. You just you move on with your life.
yeah, exactly. And that's what I love about Star Wars, is that there's so much, like, if you really want to get into it, there's so much into the story, and the different series, and the books, and the all of the different things that play into it, but it gives everybody kind of a place to enter wherever they want, and a
Yes,
place to enjoy and maybe find themselves in the story at whatever. And that's what I'm really excited about, this new High Republic kind of move that Disney's been doing over the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years with the book series, leading up to this show, is that it's opening, like you said earlier, a whole new era with new characters in the universe that we don't really know anything about, but we know kind of enough about the backstory and the Force and who the Jedi are to kind of understand the stakes. But it's an entry point for potential new fans to come into a series that they might not really know, and to find
absolutely.
a new place or new characters to uh, to connect to. I'm laughing because I watched last night's episode of The Acolyte, but we won't talk about that tonight.
Yeah. Well, my big fear with like the Acolyte or anytime Star Wars or Disney tries to take a chance is I'm afraid the backlash is so severe that they'll like feel like they need to course correct, and
Which is what
I want
happened with
more.
Rogue One
Yeah,
and
exactly. That's what happened.
Solo.
Exactly. I
Yeah,
want them pushing the envelope on what Star Wars actually can be.
I've seen some comments from the Disney crew and the creator of the Acolyte, who have basically said, like, they kind of came out preemptively before the series started released, and was like, "Your guys, so there are going to be people that aren't going to like this, but we're sticking to what the story was that we wanted to tell." And I appreciate that, because
Hmm.
it is kind of saying, like, these quote unquote fans that aren't really fans, it's like, your opinion doesn't matter to us. We're telling a story that is important. And to kind of swing it back to how you and I originally connected through writing, you know, telling your story is really important,
Yes,
and telling the story that you want to tell as a creator is important. And so by by giving into angry fans, it's dumbing down the art, and it it's not allowing the creators to tell their story. It's being forced to tell the story that some angry people who don't like other people want you to tell. And in some ways, that ties back to what we were talking about earlier, about Lucas being, his vision kind of being corrupted by money, and changing it. And so to have the creators of the Acolyte come out ahead of time and say, like, we're sticking to it, um, that, to tie it back into the message of Rogue One, that's the hope, right?
Absolutely.
We're not giving in to tyranny. We're not giving
Absolutely.
in to hate. We're gonna tell the story that's important to us, and people are gonna resonate with it.
Yep, I totally agree. That seems like a fitting note to end on. That was a beautiful sentiment, and I don't think I could say anything better than that. So let's wrap it up there.
Sounds great.
Justin, do you have anything you want to plug? Where can people find you? That kind of thing.
JustinCox.com. That's where all my stuff is. I'm at Justin Cox on Medium. And so you can find me there. The writing cooperatives on Medium. Been there a decade. And so, yeah, all kinds of fun stuff. But the easiest is JustinCox.com.
And like I mentioned at the top, Justin has a book out on writing. Check that out. Right now, WRITE now.
Yeah, check it out right now.
Yes, check it out right now, but it's WRITE.
Yeah.
Justin, this was great. I could have talked for a lot longer. I might have to have you on to talk about Solo. This might be part 1 of 2.
Hey, let me know. It sounds like a lot of fun.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Eric.
That's it for this week's episode of the pod. Check out allthefanfare.com for long-form articles, including one that ties into this week's topic. I'll be publishing an article about Star Wars here in the next couple of days. You don't want to miss it. It dives into Rogue One and some other things related to Star Wars, just kind of examining how pretty much every Star Wars you've ever seen, at least live action, is about an orphan. Like, the main character is an orphan. If you think about it, Luke Skywalker. I'm going to call Anakin Skywalker an orphan. I mean, his mom's alive, but he gets taken from her. Even people like Han Solo, Jyn Erso, talking about this week's episode, she's orphaned. Everybody you can think of that's a main character in a live-action Star Wars something. The Mandalorian, Boba Fett, they're literally all orphans. So anyway, I've got an article coming out just kind of delving into that and exploring the whys and just talking about Star Wars, because that's what I like to do. You can support the pod for only $3 a month, which unlocks all kinds of exclusive articles. I've written some really long articles about Star Wars and other things. I think the longest article is like a 25-minute read about Point Break, which is, I think, is one of my better efforts. I'm proud of that one, but there's all kinds of other ones and relate to the topic at hand. There's plenty of Star Wars material out there to keep you going. So think about supporting the pod. $3 a month. I appreciate it. Until next time, peace.